Hi everybody, this lecture focuses on how to arrange consequences to increase behavior. And when we talk about increasing behavior, we're talking about reinforcement. So first, let's go ahead and just define reinforcement. Our definition is pretty technical. So it states the process by which a stimulus change that is contingent on a response increases the future probability of that response. So I'm going to point out a couple of key aspects to this definition. The first thing is that reinforcement is a process. So it's not the reinforcing stimulus or the act of reinforcing, but it's the whole process. So it's the fact that a person engages in a behavior and then there's a stimulus change in the environment that's contingent on that behavior, and then the future probability of that behavior is going to increase. So when we talk about reinforcement, we're talking about that whole process. A lot of times people get reinforcement and reinforcer mixed up. Reinforcer is the actual reinforcing stimulus, but reinforcement is this whole process. When we talk about stimulus change, we're talking about the presentation or removal of a stimulus. And this is where it comes in with positive and negative reinforcement, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And that stimulus change is contingent on the response. So that means that stimulus change, whether you're presenting or removing a stimulus, reliably follows the response. It doesn't come before it. The person engages in the response, and then the stimulus change happens. When we talk about a contingency, we're talking about that change is dependent on the response. So it's more likely to occur when the response has just occurred. So it's essentially this if-then relationship. If the behavior occurs, then this will happen in the environment. When we talk about responses, we're talking about the specific behavior that the person engages in. And we reinforce behavior or responses, not people. So keep that in mind. A lot of times you'll hear somebody say that they've reinforced Sarah. Well, you don't reinforce a person. You reinforce a behavior that Sarah engages in. And finally, with reinforcement, it has to increase the future probability of the response. So the response to the behavior has to occur again in the future. It doesn't just affect the instance of the behavior that just occurred, but it has to increase the frequency in the future. With reinforcement, we're always talking about the effects on behavior. So if the behavior does not increase, then it's not reinforcement. So the future probability of the behavior has to increase for it to be considered reinforcement. And you guys are going to hear me say that a lot. We're always looking at the effects on behavior. That's really, really important. Okay, so here's an example of reinforcement. You have a child that tantrums at bedtime. That's the response. That's the behavior. And the parent comes in and gives the child attention, which is the consequence. The outcome of this is that in the future, the child engages in tantruming behavior at bedtime to get attention. So this satisfies all of the parts of our definition of reinforcement. So you have a behavior, the child tantruming. After the tantrum or the behavior, you have a stimulus change. So something in the environment gets added, the parent gives the child attention, and then the future probability of the behavior is increasing. So all aspects of our definition of reinforcement have been satisfied by this example. So this would be an example of reinforcement. Okay, I'm going to show you guys some other examples, and I want you to tell me if it's reinforcement or not reinforcement. So Nathan finishes all of his vegetables at dinner one night, and his parents give him ice cream for dessert. The next night, Nathan does not finish all of his vegetables. So whenever I like to figure out if it's reinforcement or not, the first thing I do is I pick out the behavior. In this example, the behavior would be Nathan eating his vegetables, or finishing all of his vegetables at dinner. And then I like to see, is that behavior Increasing, decreasing, staying the same. What's it doing? And in this example, it says the next night Nathan did not finish all of his vegetables. So the behavior is not increasing. So I know that this is not an example of reinforcement. So when you guys see these examples, I would pick out the behavior and then see if it's increasing. If it is, it's reinforcement. If it's not reinforcement. So every time Nathan tells his mom that she looks good today, his mom gives him smiles, hugs, and kisses. As a result, Nathan becomes more likely to tell his mom that she looks good. So the behavior in this example would be Nathan telling his mom that she looks good, and he's more likely to tell her, so we can see that the behavior is increasing. So this is an example of reinforcement. Alright, one day little Susie finishes all her work at school and gets a gold star for the day. Now this one's a little tricky. So our behavior is Susie finishing all of her work. But the situation doesn't tell us if the behavior has increased or decreased or what's happening with the behavior. So at this point, we actually don't know if this is reinforcement. If little Susie comes back the next couple of days and finishes all of her work, then yes, it would be considered reinforcement. If she comes back the next day and doesn't finish her work, then it would not be considered reinforcement. Every evening after Nathan has gotten ready for bed, his parents put on a DVD that Nathan can watch until his bedtime at 8. As a result, Nathan always gets ready for bed with lightning speed. So our behavior is Nathan getting ready for bed, and it's increasing because we know that he's always getting ready for bed with lightning speed. So this would also be an example of reinforcement. Okay, remember in our definition, after behavior occurs, there's a stimulus change. And there are two different types of reinforcement. There's positive or negative. And so when we refer to the stimulus change, that's what we're referring to. Either something in the environment gets added or something gets taken away. For a positive reinforcement, something in the environment gets added. So a response occurs, a stimulus is presented, and therefore the future probability of the response is going to increase. With negative reinforcement, there has to be something aversive that's in effect. The response is going to occur, and then that aversive stimulus is going to be removed, and that results in the response, the future probability of the response increasing. So if you look at both positive and negative reinforcement, they both have the fact that a response occurs, and the response increases in the future. Because remember, these are both reinforcement, and we're always looking at the effects on the behavior. So for both positive and negative reinforcement, the future probability of the response is going to increase. But positive reinforcement, it's increasing because a stimulus is presented contingent on a response. And negative reinforcement, the behavior is increasing because an aversive stimulus is removed contingent on a response. Now, as we continue on with this lecture right now, we're just going to focus on positive reinforcement. So a response occurs, a stimulus is presented, and the future probability of the response increases. And what I want to focus on right now is the stimulus that is presented. We refer to this as a reinforcer. And with positive reinforcement, it's a positive reinforcer. These are reinforcers that the person wants and the person likes. And remember, once again, positive reinforcers, they're stimuli and they're defined by their effects on behavior. So for something to function as a positive reinforcer, it has to increase the future probability of the response. If the response or the behavior doesn't increase, it's not a reinforcer. So keep that in mind. Also, a stimulus can be a reinforcer for one person, but not another. So I love chocolate. I can be reinforced with M&Ms. M&Ms will function as a reinforcer for me, but it might not function as a reinforcer for somebody who doesn't like chocolate. Good grades are reinforcers for some people, and they're not reinforcers for other people. Also, don't get caught up into whether you think this stimulus is good or bad. It doesn't really matter. as long as it increases the future probability of the response, or as long as it increases the response, then it's considered a reinforcer. So just because you think a consequence is bad, if it increases somebody's behavior, it's still considered a reinforcer. Okay. When we talk about how to use a reinforcer effectively, there are a couple of key things to keep in mind. The first one is that timing is important. So you want to deliver the reinforcer immediately after the response occurs. The longer you wait, the less effective that item will be in functioning as a reinforcer. Also, the longer you wait, the more likely it is that the organism is going to be engaged, or the learner is going to be engaging in a different behavior. So you might actually not reinforce the behavior, the target behavior that you want to. The next thing is that contingency is important. So if the response, a reinforcer is more likely to be effective if the response is consistently followed by the reinforcer. So the reinforcer occurs only if the behavior occurs. And take for example, turning your key to start the car. The behavior of turning your key is reinforced by the car starting. If you got in your car and you turned the key and sometimes the engine started and sometimes it didn't, or you got in the car and the engine started sometimes without you even turning the key, then you'd be less likely to turn the key. So that contingency is really important. You're only delivering the reinforcer if the behavior has occurred. And the last item is that the person has to want the item. So essentially there needs to be what we say an establishing operation for the item. And an establishing operation makes the reinforcer more valuable to the person and also makes the behavior that has produced the reinforcer in the past more likely to occur. There has to be some type of, for example, some type of deprivation for the person to actually want the item. Now, this can change throughout the day, which makes finding an effective reinforcer a challenge. So take food, for example. The value of food right before lunch is really, really high because your learner is hungry. But the value of food after lunch is typically really low in that the person's full, satiated, and they might not want food. When you look at social interaction, when the person's been sitting by himself, working one-on-one with a tutor, or working individually, after a certain amount of time, having some type of social interaction as a reinforcer can be really, really valuable. But after they played with their friends for an hour, then having the reinforcer be some type of social interaction might not be effective. So you have to look at what does the person want at that moment and look at the conditions and the context of the environment. Now we typically have two main categories of reinforcers. We have primary and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are often called unconditioned reinforcers, and those two terms are typically substitutable for each other. So you'll hear it be called primary reinforcers or unconditioned reinforcers. They both mean the same thing. But these are items that are reinforcers due to our evolutionary history. So we are born with these items being able to function as reinforcers. So you don't need any type of prior experience with these items. The first time that they're presented to you, they will function as a reinforcer. And examples of these are food, water, sleep, sex, shelter, air. Basically, they are reinforcers because they contribute to the survival of the individual or our species. The second category of reinforcers are secondary reinforcers, or oftentimes they're called conditioned reinforcers. These are items that function as reinforcers due to our learning history. So this is some type of neutral item that the item within itself does not function as a reinforcer, but you compare it with an item that's already established as a reinforcer. And after you pair it, that neutral item will now become a reinforcer. And when we talk about pairing it with an already established reinforcer, this can be a primary reinforcer or another secondary reinforcer. So an example of a secondary reinforcer is money. Money is a reinforcer because it's been paired with lots of different reinforcers. So if you were on an island, stranded by yourself, and you couldn't buy anything, there was no economy there, then money wouldn't mean anything to you. You wouldn't want it. It wouldn't be valued. But in our society, money has been paired with food, clothes, concert tickets, things like that. So money has been paired with lots of different reinforcers. And so money itself now becomes a secondary reinforcer or a conditioned reinforcer. Another example is attention. So parents' attention is typically a conditioned reinforcer for most children because it's been paired with the delivery of food, warmth. Another example of a secondary reinforcer are token reinforcers. And we use these a lot in the classroom and with our kids with developmental disabilities. And basically, you have a token system that requires tokens and then a backup reinforcer. The backup reinforcer is what the person actually values and what the person actually wants. The tokens get associated with the backup reinforcers. So the tokens themselves become conditioned reinforcers. And the child will earn a certain amount of tokens and will trade that amount in for the backup reinforcer. And typically you have these token boards like you see. All these items down here are the backup reinforcers. So these are the items that the person wants. So they either want a snack, to swing, computer time, to work a puzzle, to go on a walk. And basically with your token boards, the way that they're typically set up is that you'll take one of these backup reinforcers and put it in the square right here. And that way the learner can see what exactly they're working for. And then the learner will earn tokens as reinforcers. And when they get, for this specific example, when they get 5 tokens, they'll trade it in and they'll get their backup reinforcer. You can also use activities as reinforcers. And this is what we refer to as the Premack principle. It's also called Grandma's rule, if you've ever heard it be called that. But basically you take a high probability behavior that you know that the kid likes to engage in, and you can use that to reinforce a low probability behavior or behavior that the person probably is not going to engage in. So for example, if a child really likes to do the computer but doesn't like to do their homework, then you can say, okay, you do your homework first, then you have computer time. And that's Grandma's rule and referred to as the Premack principle. Okay, so when you're trying to identify reinforcers, it's really important to identify a reinforcer when you want to establish any type of new response. You have to have something that the child wants to work for. You have to have a good reinforcer for that response or that target behavior to increase. It's important when you want to strengthen specific dimensions of a behavior that already exists, and also when you want to establish new stimulus control over existing responses. So anytime you want to increase a target behavior, identifying a reinforcer is hugely important. So you have to figure out what stimuli are effective reinforcers for the person we are working with. And sometimes it can be really challenging, like we talked about earlier with establishing operations. Maybe you figured out that they'll work for food, but they might only work for food right before lunch and not after lunch. So everything kind of comes into play as to what is valuable to that person at the moment. And that's what you have to figure out for your intervention to be effective. Okay, so say you've identified a reinforcer and you start your intervention and you're trying to increase a target behavior. When the child or the learner starts to engage in the target behavior, you want to use what we call continuous reinforcement. So you want to reinforce every response. This is really important for the acquisition of the behavior. So when the child's learning the behavior, every time they engage in the behavior, you're going to reinforce that response. Now, once the child has learned the behavior and they're consistently engaging in it, then you want to kind of thin out that reinforcement. So you want to change to what we call an intermittent or a partial reinforcement. And this is when you're going to reinforce some, but not all responses. Now, ABA is systematic, so we have 4 different intermittent or partial reinforcement schedules. We have ratio schedules and interval schedules, and within each of these, you can have a fixed or a variable schedule. So we have a fixed ratio, a variable ratio, a fixed interval, and a variable interval. So let's go through each of these. Let's talk about ratio schedules first. Ratio schedules depend on the number of responses. So if you guys think ratio starts with an R, responses starts with an R, ratio, number of responses. So keep that in mind. When you're looking at the number of responses, if the learner has to make the same number of responses each time before they get their reinforcer, then that would mean that the number of responses is constant or it's fixed, and that would be a fixed ratio. If the learner has to make a variable amount of responses before they get their reinforcer, and that would be a variable ratio. So let me give you guys some examples. Fixed ratio. So say we have a dog who's learning a trick, and he learned the trick, we went through continuous reinforcement, and now we're trying to put him on a partial reinforcement schedule. So if we use the fixed ratio schedule, we're going to say that the dog gets reinforced after every 2 responses. So the dog makes 2 responses, gets his treat. 2 responses, gets his treat. 2 responses, gets his treat. And 2 responses, gets his treat. The ratio schedule is based off of a set number of responses, so that's why it's ratio. And the number of responses that the dog has to make is constant or fixed. So that's where you get your fixed ratio. So we would label this an FR2. Another example of a fixed ratio might be a toy maker. So a toy maker produces toys, and the store might only buy the toys in batches of 5. So the toy maker is rewarded and reinforced when 5 toys are delivered. So it depends on how many toys he makes, so number of responses, and it's constant or it's fixed at 5. So in that example, that would be an FR5. Variable ratio, still depending upon the number of responses, but this time the number is variable instead of fixed. So going back to our dog example, the dog might make 1 response and get reinforced, might make 2 responses and gets reinforced, might make 4 responses and gets reinforced, and might make 1 response. So when you look at this, you're going to look at the number of behaviors on average. So this is going to be a VR2. So if you took 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 1, it's going to equal 8. And if you divide it by 4, you get 2. So you know that the dog is being reinforced for his responses on average every 2 responses. Another example of a variable ratio is slot machines. So if you guys ever like to go gamble, go to casinos, your reinforcement or your payout or your win is depending upon you making a response. So you pressing the button on the slot machine or pulling the lever. And as you guys know, it's very variable. You never know when you're going to win. You might win after 15 pulls. You might win after 10 pulls. Variable ratio schedules produce very high, steady, consistent responding, high rates of responding. And that's why people oftentimes will stay in casinos for long periods of time just playing and playing. Okay, so let's talk about interval schedules. intervals depend upon the amount of time. And so with fixed interval schedules, you're going to reinforce the first response after a consistent amount of time. And with variable interval schedules, you're going to reinforce the first response after a changing amount of time. So, go back to our dogs. If on a fixed interval schedule, the dog might get reinforced for the first response after 3 minutes. Then the dog has to wait another 3 minutes. And after 3 minutes, the first response he makes, he can get his treat. He has to wait another 3 minutes. First response, he can get his treat. And this would be a fixed interval 3. So the reinforcement, the reinforcer is dependent upon time. So he cannot make a response to get a reinforcer until 3 minutes has passed. And the amount of time he has to wait is constant. So that's where you get your fixed. Another example of fixed interval oftentimes are exams. So a lot of times in college courses, you're going to have a midterm and a final. So your semester is typically 5 months long. So usually after 2.5 months, you have your midterm, and another 2.5 months, you have your final exam. Another example are weekly quizzes. So if you guys have an online class where you have weekly quizzes, then every week you have a quiz. So your quizzes are based on time, and it's a fixed amount of time each week. All right, variable interval, same type of concept as fixed interval, except that the first response that's reinforced is reinforced on a variable amount of time. So you have to wait a variable amount of time. It's not constant. So the dog may have to wait 2 minutes before he can make a response, get a reinforcer. You might have to wait 1 minute. You might have to wait 2 minutes. You might have to wait 3 minutes. And just like on the ratio schedules, when you report it, it's going to be on average. So this is a variable interval 2 schedule. So on average, he has to wait 2 minutes before he can make a response and get a reinforcer. Another example of a variable interval schedule is EMO. So your EMO, when you get EMOs, it's based off of time. And you don't know if you're going to get an EMO in 1 minute, in 3 minutes, in 10 minutes, in 30 seconds. So EMO is an example of a variable interval. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys some examples of schedules of reinforcement. And I want you guys to tell me what schedule it is. So is it fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, or variable interval? Being paid $10 for every 20 puzzles solved. So the reinforcement depends on the number of responses, so the number of puzzles that you solve. So we know it's going to be a ratio schedule, and then it's every 20 puzzles, so we know that it's fixed. So this is going to be a fixed ratio. Surprise quizzes in a class. Quizzes in the class come based off of time, and if they're surprise quizzes, then it's a variable amount of time because you're not sure if you're going to have a pop quiz in a week or in 2 weeks or in a couple of days. So this would be a variable interval. Selling a product door to door. Selling a product is based off of you selling, so your responses. So we know it's going to be ratio. And when you sell a product door to door, you never know when you're going to get a reinforcer, when you're going to make a sell. It may be after the first door, you may have to go to 3 or 4 doors, so it's variable. This is going to be a variable ratio. You get a paycheck at the end of every 2 weeks. Paychecks are based off of time, so we know it's going to be interval, and it's every 2 weeks, so it's fixed interval. Getting a strike in bowling. Bowling, a strike is based off of your responses, so it's going to be ratio, and you don't know if you're going to get a strike the first time you bowl, after you bowled 5 times, so it's variable ratio. Then a child screams in a store to get what he wants. The child screaming is based off of responses, so it's ratio, and then he never knows when sometimes he gets what he wants, so sometimes it works, so it's variable, so variable ratio. There's also a schedule of reinforcement that deals with duration of behavior. So the 4 that we've talked about are fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio, and variable interval. All deal with behaviors that are short-term or discrete. If you want to reinforce the duration of behavior, then you can use a fixed response duration or a variable response duration. So this is when you have maybe a learner that you want them to work on their homework for 10 minutes or work on their homework for a variable amount of time. You're going to use this response duration schedule as opposed to our typical ratio or interval schedules. Now, we talked earlier in the lecture about how when you first teach a behavior, you want to provide continuous reinforcement. And then after that, you want to switch to a partial reinforcement schedule like we just talked about. Now, when you switch to the schedule, you can have thinner schedules or you can have thicker schedules. So if you look at this first row, current schedule is an FR10. So remember, this is a ratio schedule, and it's fixed. So after every 10 responses, the learner gets reinforced. To thin the schedule, you're going to have the learner, more responses from the learner required to get the reinforcement. So more response effort, less reinforcement. So now you're at an FR15. So the learner has to make 15 responses before they get the reinforcer. Go back to your current schedule. If you made the schedule thicker, then you would bring it down to an FR5. So this means that you're providing less responding and more reinforcement. So now the learner only has to make 5 responses before they get a reinforcer. So you can take these schedules and you can make them thinner or thicker. And that comes into play when you're trying to essentially fade out your schedule of reinforcement. So remember at the beginning, you're providing continuous reinforcement. But once the learner is reliably engaging in the response, then you want to fade out that reinforcement and change to your reinforcement schedule. And you don't want to automatically go to a really thin schedule. You want to start with a thick schedule, and then you want to move to a thin schedule. So you're going to start off continuous reinforcement. And continuous reinforcement is actually what we refer to as an FR1. So every response gets reinforced. And then you want to start taking that really thick schedule and thinning it out. So you're now going to start requiring more responding and less reinforcement. So you might go to an FR2. So now the person has to make 2 responses before they get a reinforcer. Once they're consistently doing that, you would move to FR4. So now they have to make 4 responses before they get the reinforcer. Then you would move to FR6 and then an FR8. And now you've thinned out the schedule. Thinning the schedule is really important for maintenance. So thinning the schedule should still result in really high levels of responding. And it's really important to do this because it's really not practical to reinforce every single response. You want to essentially have the learner be engaging in the behavior on their own, and you only providing the reinforcement every so often. It helps maintain that behavior. It removes you as a necessary behavior monitor, or you don't have to monitor the learner every single second of every single day to make sure they're engaging in the behavior. And it transfers control to more natural reinforcers. So it allows the learner to essentially engage in the behavior and get reinforcers that occur naturally in the situation. And that's what you really want. Okay, so we've been talking about positive reinforcement. Let's go back to negative reinforcement. Remember that for negative reinforcement, you have something aversive as an effect. A response occurs and an aversive stimulus is removed, and therefore the future probability of the response increases. So whenever you guys are trying to figure out if a situation is positive or negative reinforcement, the first thing you're going to do, like we did at the very beginning when we were talking about reinforcement, is to identify the behavior. And then you're going to figure out, what is the behavior doing? Is the behavior increasing or is it not increasing? If it's not increasing, then you don't have to worry about if it's positive or negative reinforcement because it's not reinforcement. But if it is increasing, then you can go a step farther and figure out, okay, after the behavior occurs, is something getting added, so it would be positive reinforcement, or is something aversive getting removed, and it would be negative reinforcement. So 3 steps: identify the behavior, figure out if the behavior is increasing, and if the behavior is increasing, then after the behavior occurs, is something getting applied, or something getting added or removed. So let's practice. We have a child that starts screaming at a boring store. The parent offers to go for ice cream as soon as they're done. Next time they go to the store, the child screams again, and the parent offers ice cream. So, what's the child's behavior? First, identify that. The child's behavior is screaming. Is it increasing or decreasing? And next time they go to the store, the child screams again, so it's increasing, so we know that it's reinforcement. Now figure out, is something, after the behavior occurs, is something being added or removed? And in this example, the child gets ice cream, so something's getting added. So this contingency is positive reinforcement. Okay, same scenario, but now we're going to look at it from the parent's perspective. A child starts screaming in the boring store. The parent offers to go for ice cream as soon as they're done. Next time they go to the store, the child screams again, and the parent offers ice cream. So what's the parent's behavior? And the parent's behavior is offering ice cream. Is it increasing or decreasing? The parent offers ice cream again in the future, so it's increasing, so we know it's reinforcement. And after the child offers ice cream, it's something being added or removed. And it's being removed. So after the parent offers ice cream, the child stops screaming. So this contingency is actually negative reinforcement. There's a gray area between positive and negative reinforcement, and it does matter what perspective you're looking at. So keep that in mind. Don't get too involved in the situation. Identify the behavior, figure out if it's increasing or decreasing, and figure out after the behavior occurs, is something being added or removed. Next one. Johnny's been crying during school. His parents decide that they're not going to let him watch TV when he gets home if he cries in school that day. Johnny no longer cries in school. So our behavior is crying in school. And is it increasing or decreasing? And it says that Johnny no longer cries in school, so our behavior is decreasing. So we can tell right now that this is not reinforcement, and we don't need to figure out if it's positive or negative, because that's a moot point. And we don't need to figure out if it's positive or negative, because it's not reinforcement. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys some examples. I want you guys to tell me if it's positive or negative reinforcement. Johnny puts a quarter in the vending machine and gets a piece of candy. Next time he sees a vending machine, he puts a quarter in it. So the behavior is putting a quarter in the vending machine. Is it increasing or decreasing? Next time he sees the vending machine, he puts a quarter in it. The behavior is increasing, so we know that it's reinforcement. And what happens after the behavior occurs? So he puts a quarter in and he gets a piece of candy. So something gets added. So this is going to be positive reinforcement. Bob does the dishes every night in order to stop his mom's nagging. So the behavior is doing the dishes. And after he does the dishes, the behavior is doing the dishes. Is it increasing or decreasing? And we know that he does it every night, so it's increasing, so we know it's reinforcement. And then after he engages in the behavior, is something getting added or removed? And we see that his mom's nagging gets removed, so this would be negative reinforcement. Natalie can get up from the dinner table when she eats 2 pieces of broccoli. So her behavior is eating pieces of broccoli. And after she eats the broccoli, she can get removed from the dinner table. So this is negative reinforcement. You take an aspirin and your headache goes away. When you have a headache in the future, you take aspirin. So behavior is taking an aspirin, and after you take it, something gets removed, your headache goes away. So negative reinforcement. Nathan tells a joke and all his friends laugh. Nathan goes home that day to find another joke to tell his friends. So behavior is telling a joke. After he tells it, all of his friends laugh. So positive reinforcement. Alright, I wanted to focus on, let's go back to reinforcers. So within positive reinforcement, we talked about a positive reinforcer. With negative reinforcement, the reinforcer is that the aversive stimulus is removed. So a positive reinforcer is a little different than a negative reinforcer. And here's some examples of positive and negative reinforcers commonly used in the classroom. And you guys can kind of compare them and see the difference. Positive reinforcers, remember you're adding something. So you're giving praise, you're giving stickers, you're giving tokens, you're giving money, you're giving a smile, things like that. And you're giving things that the child wants and likes. Negative reinforcers, you're taking away something that's aversive. So you're taking away a threat, you're removing a bad grade. If someone's crying, you're engaging in behavior to remove the crying, things like that. So negative reinforcers require a child to work for the removal of an unpleasant stimulus. So their goal is basically to get rid of something unpleasant rather than to work for something desirable. And a lot of time in the education system, teachers use negative reinforcers or negative reinforcement to manage problem behavior. So a child is engaging in some type of problem behavior. Maybe they're talking when the teacher is talking, something like that. The teacher will provide them with attention. So maybe an icy stare or a reprimand. And basically it's, in a way, a threat to the child. It's aversive. So the child stops engaging in the problem behavior and the teacher removes the attention. So basically the teacher is providing attention for their problem behavior or for non-compliance and removing the attention for compliance. So the teacher is only paying attention to the child when the problem behavior is occurring. And what typically happens in this situation is that next time the child engages in the problem behavior, the child will do it until the teacher looks at them and then they'll stop doing it. And so oftentimes what we find is that basically using negative reinforcement in this way strengthens rather than weakens the problem behavior. So it might work in the short term, but it's really not effective in a long-term way. Skinner always suggests using positive reinforcement before negative reinforcement. With positive reinforcement, you're providing a reinforcer that they want for an appropriate behavior. So in that situation with their problem behavior, one way that you could deal with it would be to ignore their problem behavior and then give attention, good attention, praise, a smile for compliance or for them being on task. When you use positive reinforcement, you really build strong, respectful relationships between you and your students. Whereas negative reinforcement, they're doing something to remove something aversive. So it does not establish those really strong positive relationships between a teacher and a student. One last thing I want to talk about with reinforcers, since we talked about positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers, is that you can have a natural reinforcer or a contrived reinforcer. A natural reinforcer is an expected consequence of the behavior within that setting. So for example, once a learner completes his work, praise from the teacher is really natural. That's what typically happens in that setting. Whereas a contrived reinforcer is a reinforcer that you deliberately pick to modify a behavior within that setting. So reinforcing a learner to complete his work with M&Ms. And using M&Ms as a reinforcer for that situation is not natural. You want to use natural reinforcers as much as possible. They're more efficient. They result in more generalization, which makes the behavior more functional for the learner. So, say for example, the learner's at home and he completes his work and parents use M&Ms. Well, it's highly unlikely that when they're at school that the teacher will use M&Ms. But if the parent uses praise, which is a natural reinforcer, and the teacher uses praise, then you get a behavior that will generalize between different settings. And it's just more natural and more efficient and more effective. Now, there are situations where you can't use natural reinforcers. So a lot of times with our kids with developmental disabilities, specifically kids with autism, praise and smiles and things like that sometimes are not reinforcers. So you might have to use a contrived reinforcer. But whenever possible, try and use your natural reinforcer. Alright, that's it for reinforcement. Let me know if you guys have any questions.